Our final topic is faith and reason. Faith, in our ordinary language, this word means something like loyalty. If you have faith in me, then you uh, do what I ask you to do, and you remember me. Um, if a dog is faithful to his master, then the dog does what the master says, stays beside the master. That's ordinarily what we mean by faith. The way that St. Thomas Aquinas uses this term is different. For St. Thomas Aquinas, faith is a virtue, and we can now understand that to mean faith is a kind of habit that I have. And importantly, for St. Thomas Aquinas, faith is an intellectual habit. It's a habit of the mind. That's very different from our ordinary use of the term faith. So our task is to understand this new use of the term faith, which is also the sense in which it's used in the Catholic tradition. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, faith is one of the infused habits. In short, faith is not something that we acquire by sheer effort. It is a habit which is given to us, perhaps all at once, or perhaps gradually, act by act, I, over time, form a habit of faith. In Folio C, on pages 10 and 11, St. Thomas Aquinas provides some details about the virtue faith. I'm looking now on page 10. There, St. Thomas Aquinas provides some interesting analysis of faith, and importantly, this is another area where St. Thomas Aquinas departs from Aristotle. He's no longer interpreting and presenting Aristotle. Here, St. Thomas Aquinas is interpreting a concept of the Catholic faith. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, there are two main and necessary components of faith. First, there is the article of faith. That's a term of our author. The article of faith is some truth which is presented to me, perhaps by God, perhaps by a servant of God. For us today, ordinarily this would be some words of sacred scripture that are presented to me. Secondly, there is the act of belief which I have about this article of faith. The philosophical term is assent. When an article of faith is presented to me, I assent to this article of faith as true. Ordinarily, we think of our actions as things that we cause ourselves. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, we are not the cause of the act of faith. The cause of the act of faith is God within us. And on page 10, there's some interesting discussion there where St. Thomas Aquinas mentions some intellectuals who thought that faith was a matter of our own free will and effort, and he argues this is not true. Faith is one of the infused habits. There is a third component of faith which isn't always present, and St. Thomas Aquinas calls this an external inducement. An external inducement is something in the world around me, in my circumstances, that is present when I, at the same time, have an act of faith. So, for example, a miracle, or perhaps a statue of a saint, or perhaps I'm in church and the priest is providing the homily. An external inducement is something in the world outside of me which supports the act of faith. So, for example, often in church, in the Catholic Mass, there's readings from scriptures. Those are articles of faith. They're presented to the faithful to hear. And then after the reading of the scriptures is the homily, in which the pastor interprets those scriptures. Well, that homily is an external inducement that helps to support the act of faith which we may have had while hearing the scripture readings. So, concluding, faith is a habit and a good definition. Faith is a readiness in me to believe that truth comes from God. Faith is the readiness to believe that truth is found in the study of sacred scripture. An important topic for us to explore this semester is the relationship between faith and reason. What's this about? Well, this will be one of our first authors to talk about the relationship between faith and reason. We've seen this topic already in the Apology. In the Apology, you may recall Socrates is accused of several things, and one of the things he's accused of is claiming that the sun is a stone and that the moon is a stone. And for the Athenians making these accusations, those statements are contrary to their religion. We know today, of course, that those are statements that scientists might make, and that's exactly what they're accusing Socrates of. He's a kind of scientist looking at the heavens and forming observations about the sun and the moon and the other planets. Well, we in Athens know that those are divine beings, and that's in fact their religion. So that's an example of an antagonism between the truths of science and, on the other side, what could be truths of faith or religious truths. Similarly, in the early medieval period, one of their early Catholic theologians and philosophers is Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine, in his famous work, The Confessions, talks about science, and he says something like this, that the scientists who, for example, study the stars are very proud of counting the stars and mapping the constellations and forming theories about the nature of the celestial bodies, but they forget that these are created things, that God has lovingly created the stars for us. In their pride, they lose the fact that the celestial bodies are creations. So St. Augustine sees an antagonism between science and faith. A good definition, antagonism is the view that the truths of faith must contradict, for example, scientific truths. St. Thomas Aquinas and many of our Philosophy 225 authors will argue for the opposite view, compatibilism. Here's a definition of compatibilism. Compatibilism is the view that truths of faith may support truths of science, and truths of science may support truths of faith. These may work together to inform our human lives. And that's what St. Thomas Aquinas argues on page 11 and on page 10 of Folio C. And here's a summary of his thought. He asserts that truths of faith are a separate sphere of truth from truths of science. And the difference is this, that the truths of faith are unobservable truths. They're not truths that we can verify through our experience. They're not truths that arise through our day-to-day experiences. The truths of science, by contrast, are based on our observations, our sights and sounds, and from these immediate perceptions we form generalizations which become the truths of science. St. Thomas Aquinas says these are separate areas of truth, And moreover, says St. Thomas Aquinas, the truths of science may serve as external inducements to our faith. So, for example, when a priest provides a homily, the homily provides insights into what are truths of faith. For example, a pastor may explain a passage from a Bible and provide some insights about its meaning. For St. Thomas Aquinas, that's a kind of science, and that helps to support the act of faith that happens in me. We'll be talking about the relationship between faith and reason with all of our Philosophy 225 authors. So this is simply the first occasion when this issue comes up explicitly.